This is IEP Development for Speech-Language Pathologists Part 1, with a focus on present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. My name is Angie Neal, and I'm the Speech-Language Pathology Consultant and Policy Advisor for Speech-Language Services and Early Literacy at the South Carolina State Department of Education, Office of Special Education Services. One of the first things to talk about is what's referred to as the thread of consistency. And what that means is that the information provided within an IEP should connect to each other. So the present levels should connect to the services, should connect to the goals, should connect to the impact statement. All of them should be consistent with that thread of consistency running throughout the document. We're going to begin our discussion about IEPs by talking about eligibility first. The reason for this is because if you think about it, the IEP also includes information related to ongoing eligibility, or it connects to the initial eligibility. So the PLAAFP and the needs section, well, those identify those specific skills that were identified as part of the disability, and that those skills require specially designed instruction. And the PLAAFP and the impact statement, that data documents and explains how the disability negatively impacts the student's ability to access and progress towards educational standards or participate in age-appropriate activities. So here you see how those prongs of eligibility relate to the sections of the IEP. As a quick reminder, what is specially designed instruction? Well, special education is specially designed instruction that includes adapting the content, adapting the methodology, adapting the delivery of instruction in order to address unique needs of a student. So in doing so, we need to consider whether or not the student's needs are significantly different from same age or same grade peers. We also need to consider how is the content, the knowledge and skills being taught, the methodology, the strategies or programs, and the delivery, the way in which the instruction is delivered, how is it different from general education? And typically the way that specially designed instruction is different from general education is that we're providing additional strategies for learning, we're providing scaffolding, we're developing the underlying skills for mastery, we're also providing significant amount of repetition and additional practice with feedback, as well as more time and explicit instruction. And that is how specially designed instruction differs from general education instruction. It's also important to keep in mind that specially designed instruction, the whole goal of specially designed instruction is to ensure access of the student to the general education curriculum, to those educational standards that apply to all students, which makes this a very important topic to go over in more depth. So when considering specially designed instruction, we want to make sure we're looking at, again, how are those needs that are identified in the IEP, how are they related to the identified area of disability? Also, how is the specially designed instruction relating to their students' ability to access and progress towards standards, and which educational standards is the student struggling with? And does specially designed instruction require the unique skills and expertise of the SLP in order to access and progress towards the standards? All of which is consistent with an OSIP memorandum from 2015 that states that, consistent with general education and academic standards, the IEP team must ensure that the annual IEP goals are aligned with the state standards for the grade that the child is enrolled in. But what does that mean if the student is significantly below grade level? Well, the IEP team needs to estimate the current rate of growth towards those educational standards for the grade that they're enrolled in. We also need to calculate what that rate of growth needs to be in order to close that gap and meet grade level proficiency, and then determine annual goals that are ambitious enough to get that student to get to that rate of growth that's needed, but also goals that are achievable. So the annual goals do not necessarily have to result in the child reaching that grade level within that year, but the goals should be sufficiently ambitious to help close that gap, to work towards closing that gap. As mentioned, because specially designed instruction and special education is meant in order to help the student achieve and access and progress towards the educational standards, we need some familiarity with the educational standards. And with the change to the new 2024 English Language Arts standards, it's important to go over those because there's so many overlaps with speech and language impairment. But to first explain what's the difference between the previous ELA standards and the current ELA standards in South Carolina, I want you to know that there's been a 33% reduction in the number of strands, a 50% reduction in the number of standards, and a 56% reduction in the number of grade level indicators, and that there are now 4 strands plus overarching expectations. And so what you'll see here is number 1, the first standard area, strand, is what's referred to as applications of reading. That's applicable to every grade level. And there's 10 standards within that strand, and 3 of them are specific to vocabulary. Foundations of literacy, that really is more applicable to kindergarten through 2nd grade because they are a development of foundational skills. There's also a strand for research, as well as written and oral communication. What you see here is an embedded link and also a screenshot of what this looks like on the South Carolina Department of Education website. What you see here first is a link or an arrow pointing to the standards. This is where you can pull up the standards. Also, you see arrows pointing towards instructional resources as well as professional learning opportunities. And I wanted to specifically point out a few of them. The first being the grammar and conventions matrix. This will outline very clearly exactly which morphemes should be introduced and mastered at specific grade level. The same thing goes for complex sentence types, compound complex, simple sentence types. There's also a vocabulary support document. There's been a lot of professional development provided to teachers regarding explicit and systematic instruction in vocabulary that will be good for the speech language pathologist to be aware of. There's also a crosswalk between what were the early learning standards and then how do they connect to the current kindergarten standards for ELA. There's a Foundations of Literacy support document. It outlines not only the specific skills within phonological awareness, but also how phonics relates to morphology and the specific expected patterns for how to add morphemes when spelling. And then finally, there's a link to the indicator aligned inventory for word recognition. Again, this is a document that has been shared with all teachers, including reading interventionists, that would be helpful for speech language pathologists to be aware of as well. One of the most helpful documents for all special education staff is what's referred to as the vertical alignment. This is for grades K through 12. The reason this is so helpful is because, as you see pictured here, you can see kindergarten all the way through English 4. Exactly what is the progression of development for that standard based on each grade level? What's expected to be taught and mastered for each grade level? The beauty of this vertical alignment and seeing how this standard is systematically laid out across each grade level is that it helps create a map from point A to point B to point C for how to close that gap in order to achieve mastery of that standard. I'm going to take a few moments on these slides to go over, not all of them certainly, but many standards that are very specifically relevant to speech language impairment. And these are very specifically the standard, but again, refer back to the grade level indicators as I just showed you on the previous slide so that you can look and see exactly what is the grade level expectation. So under ELA F1, F stands for Foundations of Literacy. In the Foundations of Literacy, students are expected to demonstrate early to basic phonemic and phonological awareness in spoken words. In OE, that's overarching expectations, students are expected to share knowledge in a variety of ways, to make inferences, to collaborate with others and use active listening skills, as well as in the domain of oral and written communication, you see listed as ELAC3, to write narratives. So right here, you already see both speech production, speech sound production, and language and pragmatics as being critical components of the ELA standards. Now you'll see morphology. When we talk about ELAC, or written and oral communication, where we're asking students to command standard English grammar, so your morphemes and your syntax. Also to organize and communicate ideas through a range of formats and to a variety of audiences. To again collaborate, to evaluate and critique ideas, and to use critical thinking skills. To look at those key literary elements, and for narratives, to know those specific narrative components that support and deepen meaning and support comprehension. Under applications of reading, we also see summarizing and paraphrasing to support comprehension. And then we see the 3 separate standards related to vocabulary. And they are applications of reading 7, 8, and 9 for determining or clarifying the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases, which would be figurative language. Looking at word relationships and nuances of word meanings, that's really thinking about and looking at vocabulary from the standpoint of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 words, as well as building a range of academic vocabulary and morphology, as you see there as well. What about the standards for preschool? Well, again, you see the embedded link here for the South Carolina Early Learning Standards. And so what you see is the strand in gold here of language development and communication. Then you see the goal or the standard of children asking and answering questions to seek help, to get information, or clarify something that's not understood. And then in the red box, you see the indicators. These indicators are a little bit different in that it's outlining exactly what is the progression of development to age appropriate. So it outlines that progression, which then again helps support writing systematic IEP goals in order for the student to close the gap and achieve mastery of appropriate standards. So here are some of the early learning standards for preschool that are especially relevant to speech language impairment. So first, under language development and communication, we see phonological awareness again. Approaches to play and learning, APL, we see increasing complex play. Under emotional and social development, we see social and behavioral skills in order to participate in a group. For health and physical development, as represented by HPD6, we see children being aware of their needs, that meta-linguistic awareness, in order to communicate what their needs are. Continuing on with language development and communication, we see understanding communication from other people and participating in conversation with peers and adults. Continuing on, we see asking and answering questions, as we just pointed out, communicating thoughts, feelings, and ideas, describing people, places, things, and events, and using most grammatical constructions of their home language. In addition, we see responding to and growing their vocabulary, knowledge of the alphabet and the alphabetic principle, which is making that connection to the sounds within the words that they've been speaking and hearing to what they look like as represented by lines and dots and squiggles and circles. That's the alphabetic principle. But it begins with that awareness of sound, individual sounds, units of sounds, that phonology. Also, understanding the early sorting, describing, and looking at patterns, which relates to math. But also under math is identifying, describing, classifying, and understanding shape, size, direction, and movement, especially during play, but also in other activities. And again, as mentioned, the ability to think about their own thinking, to reason, to understand perspectives of other people, and to make decisions. All of that information is going to be connected now to when we discuss present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. IDEA specifically requires a statement of the child's present levels of academic and So academic achievement and functional performance, including how it impacts their involvement and progress towards the general education curriculum, which is the same as for non-disabled children, and for preschool children, as mentioned, how it impacts their participation in age-appropriate activities. So as you see here, here's that connection. The strengths and needs, that is outlined for academic and functional performance, and the impact statement, again, makes that connection to that adverse educational impact. Let's talk first about strengths. IDEA requires that strengths are put down on that IEP for both academic strengths and functional strengths. Now, what we're going to be going over on the next few slides are examples that will help you document and explain strengths for both academic and functional. Here's a quick screenshot that shows academic achievement, looking at strengths, and that this is required. Here's another screenshot. It's specific to Ed Plan, looking at functional performance strengths, and this documentation is required. And here's some examples of possible academic strengths. Now, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but again, think about these related to the educational standards we just discussed. So it could be strengths in demonstrating grade level ELA standards related to some of the specific ones we outlined before. It could be progress towards IEP goals, teacher data on increased intelligibility, your data, SLP data, on improvement in specific ELA areas, including phonological awareness or vocabulary. It could also be active engagement in classroom discussions. Again, that's one of the overarching expectations. Exchanging thoughts and ideas with classmates, asking and answering questions, collaborating with peers in small group activities. Again, all part of the ELA standards we just discussed. Strengths could also include, really and truly thinking about preschool, observations of any improvements in problem solving, or asking for help, or appropriately labeling and expressing emotions, as well as observational data related to the student's interactions with peers. And this could be what the baseline data increases look like relative to turn taking, to sharing, to what that student has moved along in terms of the developmental continuum of play, or their ability to offer help, or take on leadership roles, or their progression towards more components of narrative skills. And for school-age students, very important to consider the data relative to decoding and encoding, reading and spelling, looking specifically at the teacher's data about the student's reading fluency, the student's letter name and letter sound fluency, as well as any increases in the student's lexile level. Now, I put a special note here pointing out that lexile levels are appropriate to report, but Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment levels, such as the student is reading at a level D or a level M, those are not appropriate to report. Now let's look at possible functional strengths. Again, not an exhaustive list, just some examples. So some functional strengths could be repeating or rephrasing information when it's not understood, taking and applying good feedback, following classroom routines and rules and expectations and procedures, all of which are listed there. It could be utilizing peers to help them understand or to help them follow directions, including how to complete different activities or assignments, asking for help independently or with cues, and how that asking has become more appropriate. Same thing with starting work tasks and what that might look like over time. They might move from using visuals to reminders to independently. Same thing with use of self-regulation strategies. Now let's talk about the needs section. While strengths are needed for both the academic and functional sections of the IEP, I'll say it again, strengths are needed for both the academic and functional section of the IEP, needs only need to be completed for one if it only impacts one. So, to be very clear though, because there's been a lot of question about what is academic versus what is functional. And the thinking used to be that it was academic if it was language, and it may be functional if it is speech. And that is not the case. If it is academic, that means it's related to that academic work, the ELA standards, as I just outlined. Functional could be something else. But there is no rule of thumb necessarily to say whether it's academic or functional, because that decision has to be made based on the data that's available. So if the data supports that there's academic related needs, specifically again referring maybe to those ELA standards, then yes, that would be considered academic. So in that example number 1, if the data gathered reveals an adverse educational impact related to ELA standards, such as we described, then yes, you pick academic. But let's say, for example, the data gathered reveals it's more functional. So for example, maybe the student is having difficulty expressing their emotion when they're upset. So that would be more of a functional impact, and that would be the more appropriate choice. Here's your screenshot. And again, what it points out is we're talking about needs, we're talking about academic achievement, and then you have the choice either to select yes, and then you have to put the data in the box, that will be required, or you select no, and then it would not be required. The same is true for functional. We see that we're looking at the area of need, we're looking at functional, and then you have the choice. If you select yes, there's a functional need, then you have to describe it in the box. If you select no, you're not required to describe it in the box. But again, to be very clear, you only have to pick one. There may be data that says it should or could be both, but you only have to pick one. Now let's talk about the impact statement. Again, this is going to relate specifically to documenting that continued ongoing eligibility related to adverse educational impacts. And this is why we need to revisit the difference in the terminology. Do we use the term ongoing eligibility or dismissal? Well, I want you to erase your brain from the term dismissal. We only use the term eligibility or ongoing eligibility because they are either eligible or not. There are not two different standards for students who are eligible to receive services based on either an initial or an ongoing basis. In other words, to continue services. So we must make sure that we're providing data that supports and explains how the student continues to meet all of the prongs of eligibility that we've already described. And that data must be specific to that individual student, and it must be specific data. So statements such as this difficulty may impact their ability to read, spell, and be understood, that is not specific, and it is not individualized to the student, so it would not be compliant. So again, what we're looking at is how this information is listed in the IEP. For example, in the needs section, we may be talking about the priority in educational needs in academic achievement, and the impact statement may support that by indicating how the student's disability impacts their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. And here's a screenshot from EdPlan that outlines this. So we see the question above. Does the disability affect involvement and progress in general education curriculum? General education. This again, this is your adverse educational impact statement. If you select no, then that student is no longer a student with a disability under IDEA. If you select yes, then you have to answer the question of how do we know? How do we know that the disability is impacting their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum? What is the specific and individualized data for this student? And here are some examples. So in your needs section for academic achievement, you may say based on the student work. So looking at student work, you may see that the student is struggling to misspell words because they've got the identified error of R's, the R sound. All of the words that they have with R's are misspelled. And then that connects to the impact statement or should be carried over into the impact statement, which explains and documents how that impacts their ability to make progress with the ELA standards related to mastery of phonics. So again, that's that ELA standard of foundation of literacy and phonics. For DLD, or developmental language disorder, again, you may have the need statement in the area of academics, and it may show, if you pull those curricular assessments, so those end of unit assessments, so a social studies test, you may see that number one, that student is struggling to read those syntactically complex passages and understand them in order to answer the questions. And that may also interfere with their ability to make inferences and to compare and contrast, as well as difficulty with narrative skills, which they should be able to do according to those ELA standards and that vertical alignment of the grade level indicators. And then that ties in, or should be pulled in, to how that impacts their ability to involvement and progress in the general education curriculum for mastery of those ELA standards. In a preschool example, a lot of that would be based on both the teacher's input and your observation. And what you again may see for academic, and keep in mind, everything a student does in preschool is building that academic foundation for learning readiness. So carefully consider how the student is struggling with the play with same age peers, clear communication, as well as describing and sorting. Again, all of the areas of preschool, early learning standards that we just discussed. And then again, what's the connection to? How do you pull that into the impact statement relative to their progress towards the early learning standards? Now let's talk a little more specifically about the PLAAFP data. Data should be collected from a variety of sources. That includes parents, as well as teachers, as well as special education teachers and related service personnel. We need data from all of those individuals because an IEP is a team document. But it is especially important to get that data from the classroom teacher, again, in order to look at those adverse educational impacts. So, in your initial IEP, you really need to make sure that those strengths are connected to what are the strengths listed in the evaluation. For an annual review, we need to make sure that those strengths are also supported in the findings. Here's a screenshot from EdPlan looking at the present levels and the various sources of data. The sources of data are especially important because for an initial IEP, let's go ahead and jump down to Roman numeral II, the content of the child's IEP. We have to make sure the data includes a variety of assessment tools and strategies, and a variety of assessment tools and strategies had to gather functional information, developmental information, and academic information in order to determine if the child is a child with a disability and the content of the IEP. So for an initial IEP, when looking at sources of data, be very sure to select several sources of data because one tool or one strategy cannot provide data to meet all of those areas. We'll discuss that a bit more once we get to the specific videos for each area of disability. Now let's talk about non-standardized assessment. And it's highlighted in red because this is a move away from the term informal assessment because there is no such thing as an informal assessment. Assessments are neither formal or informal. Any kind of assessment that requires the skills and expertise of an SLP to interpret and to apply to instruction is either going to be standard or non-standardized. That said, for an annual review, you can use and should use non-standardized tools to gather data. This could include tools to update where the student may fall in the progression of developmental expectation, in addition to looking at previous IEP goals, to review progress towards annual goals, reviewing other concerns or data outlined in the previous IEP, and for sure, selecting parent input and teacher input, as I've got highlighted here in blue, because they are required as part of the IEP team. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share a bit more with you about a non-standardized assessment that may be very helpful. However, as a quick reminder, the purpose of assessment for annual review in creating a new IEP is to gather data denoting progress towards goals and what goals need to be created next in order to remediate that speech-language deficit or to close that gap. Standardized tests do not do that. Standardized tests are only designed to identify whether a student exhibits deficits when compared to normative sample of same-age peers. So standardized assessments are not designed for progress monitoring, and they should never be used for gathering data for annual review. As mentioned, this is a diagnostic tool that has been shared with general education teachers, special education teachers, reading interventionists, school psychologists. It is called the Indicator Aligned Inventory for Word Recognition. This is a tool that is designed to look specifically at our ELA standards in phonemic and phonological awareness, concepts of print, phonics for decoding and encoding, and oral reading fluency. And every single one of those types of professionals, including speech-language pathologists, can administer this tool. This tool does not belong to any one person because ELA standards are not the responsibility of any single one person. As mentioned on the website, there are instructional resources and webinars and trainings to help understand this a bit more, but as a quick introduction, one of the first things that this tool looks at is the letter sound correspondences. And I say this because it's important to keep this in mind in terms of what a student's error phoneme may be for speech sound production, but also if your student speaks another language or a dialect, how might this impact their knowledge of letter sound correspondences? And while this document, of course, is too hard to see, what I want to point out on this overview picture is that this document, or each section, is broken down into semesters. So what you see here on the left is kindergarten first semester. So the first 2 9 weeks of school. On the right, you see the second semester. So the last 2 9 weeks of school. The reason it's broken up into semesters is because we do not want to assess a student on skills they haven't been taught yet. But we also want to be able to identify and remediate as quickly as possible any possible gaps. So what you see outlined in green are the specific standards and indicators that are that you're being prompted on. In that salmony orange color, it tells you what exactly the tools are that you need for that prompt. In purple, what is the actual prompt? And then in blue is the criterion for mastery. And the criterion for mastery will always be 100% because these are what students are expected to know and be able to do by the end of either that semester or that grade level. Then there are 2 ways to break down the findings. They can be done either by looking specifically at the grade level. So if you have a first grade student and you want to know what first grade skills the student should be able to demonstrate, or you have a brand new second grader and you want to look at what first grade skills they should know and be able to demonstrate, you can look at that at a glance by looking at putting an X through each of the areas, each of the foundational areas, each of the standards, phonological awareness, concepts of print, phonics, and automatic word recognition, that maybe the student has not mastered. However, it may be more helpful to look at the breakdown of findings by standard. When you look at them by standard, you look at exactly what is the standard and then all of the skills along the continuum. So here you see an example where you see kindergarten and what specific difficulties the student had as marked by the red X. Then you see first grade. What are those indicators that should have been mastered in first grade? And then second grade. What indicators should have been mastered there? And again, we should use this type of systematic data to create systematic IEP goals or even reading intervention plans. And when we talk about systematic IEP goals, we're really referring to goals that follow a very mapped out sequence of instruction, that progression of development, so that we make sure there's no holes or gaps and to make sure that we're efficiently closing any gaps. And so when we use systematic IEP goals, we're also supporting consistent understanding by every member of the IEP team to identify exactly where the student is in terms of grade level and indicators, exactly what skills the student needs to master, and exactly what the sequence is for how to get them on grade level so that we can close that gap between the student and typically developing peers. And then finally, in terms of systematic IEP goals and tools like this that everyone can administer, that helps support collaborative IEP goal writing, which is one goal that is being addressed through a different lens, maybe one lens being through the educator and one lens through maybe the speech language pathologist. And what this does is this supports collaboration amongst all IEP team members in order to work together to bring about change efficiently and effectively. And that is why the last part of this indicator-aligned inventory includes a summary of findings. And as you see in blue, this will be where teams can check this is exactly where the student should be because this is their grade level or the last grade level that they've achieved. However, as indicated by the red, this is where they are. So this helps very clearly and visually outline what is the gap. Then you point to or you illustrate exactly what are the skills that we'll be touching on in this IEP or this intervention. And then the beauty of this is when we all know exactly what the skills are that are in need, we can give both teachers and families things that they can do at home. So I thank you so much for your time and attention and attendance for this IEPs Part 1 webinar, and look for IEPs Part 2 to be coming in the near future. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.